Okay, people, I'm right up on your grill, but I'm not going to be for long. We're going to do a podcast on transitional fossils. And the best way to do that is to show you some pictures. We're going to do it up close. So I'm going to be talking, but you're not going to see my ugly face. Okay, so let's do this. Now, up here on the board, okay, the whiteboard, I have a word that says transitional fossils. Okay, now, what we mean by that is something that shows a transition between forms. Okay, so I have some pictures up here on the whiteboard. Now this is as basic as it can get, okay, and it's basically as, I don't know, caveman-ish as it can get, because I just printed some pictures off my printer and I'm going to show you. Okay, but it's pretty simple here. When we talk about transitional fossils, one of the best examples that I show my students are whales. Okay, now the reason why we do whales is because they show very distinct transitions between forms as they evolved into the modern creatures that they are. Okay, so let's move over here and let's look at the first one. We'll talk about this one quite a bit. Okay, now this is just showing the skeleton of what we call Pakicetus. Okay, now Pakicetus was basically a land creature, not really that much unlike a coyote or a wolf. Okay, just to kind of paint a picture in your mind what it looked like a little bit. Okay, Pakicetus, as you can tell, it had some pretty gnarly teeth there. It's got a skeleton not much unlike a dog, okay, or a wolf. It's got the four legs, four limbs. It's got all the fingers and digits there, you know, the ribs, the longer tail. Now what happened was, the first thing they ever found with the Pakicetus was a skull. The skull had distinct teeth and an inner ear bone that was very much like modern whale ear bones and teeth, okay, per se. The only other mammals that basically show these distinct teeth and ear bones are whales and dolphins, modern day. Okay, so that basically pointed scientists toward maybe this being an ancestral species of whale. Well, people didn't buy it. Okay, we needed proof, and you can't tell people. As a girl said in my class, there's no dang way you can tell me that a whale came from a wolf. Okay, well, I didn't tell her a whale came from a wolf, alright? But if I just showed you this picture and a modern whale and said, yeah, this is an ancestral form of a whale, people are going to think I'm crazy, okay? So we have to think of a few things that we know are other distinct features of modern whales, okay? Their nose. The blowhole is their nose, and it's on top of their skull. Okay, they have no hind leg. They have a very strong flipper-like tail. So we would be looking for these transitions in the fossils that led up to modern whales. Okay, so let's move down to the Rhodocetus. Okay, the Rhodocetus is a very powerful water-dwelling creature now. We can still see that it has the hind leg, probably used a little bit for propulsion. But there are a couple of distinct things. One, the hind leg is not as developed as the land creature that we saw. It is starting to get a longer, more powerful tail that would be used for swimming. And if we look here, okay, one thing we notice, and we'll call this nasal drift. The nose is starting to move backwards, okay, toward the top of the head from the front. Now look at Pakicetus. Okay, nose is still right there in front like we would expect with a wolf or a coyote or a modern dog. Okay? But here with the Rhodocetus, we see nasal drift starting to happen. Okay? Now, we'll move on to another transition. So when we come down here to the Durodon, okay? Now I'm skipping a few transitions, all right? I mean, there might be 3 or 4 other transitional fossils in between the ones I'm showing you. I'm just showing you a few distinct ones and what they show. Okay, so if quite a few millions of years later, we find fossils of the Durodon. Now, it's going to have a more defined back tail for propulsion, and we see this hind leg is starting to disappear or go away, guys. Okay, it's becoming less used. There's not really a function for it anymore, and so it's more or less just dangling at this point. Okay, now look at the Durodon, that front leg. It's becoming more fin-like instead of arm-like. Okay, it's pretty much like a fin used for propulsion, or sorry, not propulsion, but for steering the whale, kind of like a rudder on an airplane. Okay, now look at the nasal drift on the Durodon. Okay, as we come up here, the nose has moved all the way, okay, sort of almost above the eyeballs on the Durodon here on the skull. All right, so we see distinct nasal drift in the Durodon. All right, one other thing that we can't see here is that the ear bones were up here more toward the top to begin with. With the Durodon, they're starting to migrate down where they are found here in modern whales. Okay, so there were kind of two distinct features here. When we move on to the Basilosaurus. Now, you guys, when we found the Basilosaurus fossils, first of all, we found them in the middle of Egypt. Okay, in the middle of a desert, which tells us one thing: there used to be an ocean there. Another thing that was just astounding with the Basilosaurus, it showed the whale-like teeth, that whale-like ear, but they found hind limbs on this whale fossil. They knew it was a whale. What they couldn't believe, was this was a transitional fossil showing the remnants of a leg that once existed, but that had no function. It now was almost like the human appendix. It was still there, but it had no function. It was slowly going away. Okay, so this continued telling the story of whale evolution. All right, with the Basilosaurus, we see nasal drift. Okay, the nose is still continuing to move back up to the top of the skull. Okay, so it's showing transition, many transitional features here with the Basilosaurus. Okay, I didn't put a picture of a modern whale up because you know what they look like. Okay, dolphins and killer whales, which basically are the cousins of dolphins, okay, and modern whales are all related, okay, and they all descended from creatures like this. So we're kind of looking at the whale evolution in quick mode. Okay, here's a picture that shows the nasal drift. Okay, so to the left we see Pakicetus. Okay, Pakicetus had that nose opening, the nasal opening in the very front of the skull, not unlike a modern wolf or coyote. Okay, then we see something like the Durodon, okay, Protocetus, that had the nasal bone moving back toward the top of the head. Okay, now the far right is a picture of a modern beluga whale where the nasal opening is to the very back of the skull or on top of the skull. Okay, that's a modern whale, and so we kind of see nasal drift. Those are things we were looking at. So when we talk about transitional fossils, we are talking about fossils that show transition, that tell a story about the type of evolution we are talking about. Okay, you can't say that the first fossil, Pakicetus, evolved into modern whales without fossils giving evidence of the transition, showing different features from one fossil to the next, showing distinct transitions or movements of different joints, the nose in this case, and the disappearance of the hind leg. Last thing, tell you a story. Okay, when modern whaling ships in the 1700s, 1800s started to find modern whales and tear them apart and gut them and use them for what they did, they would use the whole whale, every part. And they would find whales with hind limbs, okay? The pelvic girdle and these little short, tiny little limbs. And it kind of freaked them out a little bit. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know about mutation and stuff like that. They couldn't explain it. They didn't know about whale evolution, that whales came from a land creature a long time ago. They just couldn't explain where the whales come from. Nowadays we can explain, hey, where'd those hind legs come from? They were slowly disappearing. And some modern whales still have remnants of the hind leg, the pelvic girdle that hold the legs, because it still hasn't completely disappeared. Kind of like our appendix, okay, and goosebumps. All right, that's about it for transitional fossils. Peace out.